Welcome to the Healing Grove podcast. I'm Dr. Kristin, an integrative holistic family physician, author of Life After Lyme, and host in this virtual space of learning, healing, and growing. I believe humans are like trees, and our physical limb is only one of many. Health on all limbs of the tree, emotional, conceptual, social, spiritual, is absolutely required for the whole tree that is you to be vibrantly well. I created the Healing Grove podcast as a place to showcase some of the world's best integrative and holistic medicine, to expose you to transformative tools and mindset shifts for all limbs of your tree. I hope you enjoy our conversation in the Healing Grove today as much as I enjoyed having it. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Healing Grove podcast, where I am delighted and excited to talk today with my new friend, Keith Ellis. So let me tell you a little bit about Keith before we get started. He's the founder of Science Driven Supplements, which is the maker of Circuguard, a product which he's found to be very effective for helping folks with long COVID. And we're going to get into all the reasons for that in this podcast episode. Keith spent years in industry developing medicines and now is an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, where he teaches courses ranging from intro-level surveys for first years all the way up to graduate students and pharmacists. He holds a PhD in biological sciences and has dedicated his career to studying complex systems within the body, particularly focusing on circulation and cardiovascular health. With a deep commitment to evidence-based and integrative health, like me, he found himself dismayed is maybe a gentle word during the pandemic by the lack of research and attention that was being devoted to understanding both acute COVID and its effects and also potential therapies for COVID in the beginning, other than a shot. And then later to long-term effects of long COVID, which so many of you guys are suffering from right now. His frustration motivated him to dig deeper into understanding how the body responds to such conditions and how natural interventions might help mitigate these impacts. And he's landed on some really fascinating ones that I hope you'll stick around for. So I love that his approach starts with modern science and evidence-based literature, and then extrapolates and reverse engineers mechanisms that are known to see what natural products can also do the job. And so that's sort of the most exciting part about what you're doing at Circuguard. So Dr. Keith Ellis, thank you for coming to the Healing Grove podcast today.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun conversation because I think we have a lot of overlap in terms of what we saw sort of happening during the pandemic around not only, sort of what was going on with evolving understanding of the virus, but just sort of lack of interest in how to actually, make people not just flatten a curve, which by the way means everybody still gets sick. They just get sick in a more gradual and measured way so they don't overwhelm the hospital systems. But like, what about reducing the curve? Like, what about all the things that all the repurposed drugs and medicines and supplements and natural things, including whole real foods and including sunlight and vitamin D levels and joy and, social contact and all the things that were sort of stripped away during that crazy period, what about those? And so I really love talking to people who kind of were kind of eyes wide open during that time, being like, what the hell is going on and how do I plug in? So talk to me about what that was like for you and where you were when you kind of had that realization and how it shifted for you, what you're doing now.
Sure. So I'm going to actually back up to the very beginning of the pandemic, because I actually haven't ever talked about this. And I think it's relevant to what you're talking about in terms of people's reaction to things. So I actually saw the lockdowns of the pandemic coming in February of 2020. And it was just totally random. I was working on something for one of my projects. I needed some help with a computational experiment I wanted to do for a project. And I went asking around, I was like, hey, who's the person that can talk to me about how to do this? Right. And I knew some of the grad students knew how to do it. And I got the response I got was, oh, you need to talk to this person, but you can't talk to her for another 2 weeks. She's in quarantine. And I was like, quarantine? What's going on? And they told me, oh, well, she just got back from Wuhan, and because she's from China, and her boss put her in quarantine for 2 weeks. This was in February, before anybody had even heard about what was going on with COVID. And I was like, okay, that's bad. That's really bad that's already kind of coming this way. And it is that her boss felt like she should be in like in quarantine for a while. So I was one of those people, and you know, I work in the lab. I have a chemistry lab, I have a biology lab. We do mammalian cell culture. Like I'm used to trying to take precautions against viruses and bacteria, mainly to protect the experiments we're doing. So I was all about like masking and gloving up, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic. But then as time went by and as we went into the lockdowns and the lockdowns persisted, we started knowing and understanding more about COVID and the risk and what it really did and what we could do before it and what we were deciding not to do for it, which is what kind of set my radar off of it seemed like we weren't really doing things the way we would normally do them if we were really trying to solve problems and treat people the way we did prior to the beginning of 2020, right? And that's what kind of set my spidey senses off, that COVID was being treated differently and we were really examining it differently and not doing what we normally do. So yeah, the flatten the curve, you know, it's to me, I like to always look at root causes of things. I'm a big mechanisms of action person, right? My real interest as a scientist is in developing small molecules and exploring natural products and their mechanisms of action and how they can affect human health. So when we started the whole COVID pandemic journey in science and in medicine, you know, things were kind of weird, right? We weren't really, yeah, we went off and explored antivirals, but we did it in a different way than we normally do. You know, telling people not to come into the hospital till they're too sick and needed more help and support than they could get elsewhere. It seemed like the way we were doing things was not great for the acute phase of the COVID pandemic. And I kind of left it alone when we were in that phase. I knew a lot of my colleagues that started immediately writing papers on COVID, writing grants to get COVID funding, because all of a sudden the system started putting out a ton of uh, solicitations for grants, and everybody seemed to wanted to get in on looking at the science of COVID. And it was not something I had a lot of experience with, that those types of viruses, and not something I really wanted to work on. So I kind of just sat on the sideline as a spectator for a while and observed. And I did that for a couple years, and then I realized things are not really getting better. And I didn't particularly care for the way that it was being approached. So I decided to step in and try and do something myself. And that's when I really started looking for a project in the area, and then it went a very unexpected direction once I really got into it.
Okay, so for people who are not scientists or used to looking
Mhm,
for new projects to work on or new questions to ask, can you give us a little
mhm.
sneak peek into kind of what that process looks like?
Sure. So I do what I characterize, what I call early stage lead discovery. So I kind of work on what I think of as the early stage or the front end of trying to develop new pharmaceutical drugs. So, and I find that area interesting because it pulls together things like learning about the disease state and mechanistically what causes the disease state, what we would call pathophysiology. It pulls together actually looking in detail at a biological target. It's typically a protein, right? You have to learn all about the protein. You need to understand its structure. You need to understand its function. You take those two and put it together with, now I need to find a small molecule that can bind to and in some way correct the function of that protein to have an impact on the disease, right? Bringing all those components together, those are the intellectual problems that I find interesting, right? Because I'm a chemist and I'm a medicinal chemist, and it's that mechanisms aspect in the biological realm, but then also bringing in this piece of trying to discover um, small molecules that can modulate those biological targets. And I actually started out my career working on natural products and doing natural product total synthesis and using natural products as the starting point to develop new therapeutics, right? So that's kind of the lens that I bring to all of that process. So when I want to go into literature, when I'm ready to start a new project, like I was after the pandemic, I will typically go into literature and say, okay, what's a disease state area that I'm interested in? What is a particular new target, or what's some new knowledge in that area where we know more than we did and we haven't figured out a way to develop drugs or natural products to kind of use that information to actually improve human health. And that's usually the starting point for a project for me.
It's so fascinating. Thank you for breaking it down. It makes me kind of want to go to grad school and, and ask interesting questions and have some resources to really dig into them because I think mechanistically too, and root causes are, I mean, the
Mm,
only place I want to sort of be playing. So
yeah.
how did you land on the particular root cause and mechanism that you finally found your way to?
So in early 2023, the pandemic and the lockdowns were kind of done. We were in that that post-pandemic period where things were starting to get back to normal. I was looking for a new project, and I was less interested in acute COVID infections because I feel like as science and as medical establishment, we kind of have a handle on how to deal with those, right? We understand viral infections, we understand antiviral drugs. We by 2023, people had kind of stopped dying from acute COVID infections for the most part, somewhat from mutation of the virus, somewhat from being able to understand how to care for those patients better. But at that point, there was this new issue emerging in the COVID area of long COVID, right? And it's these patients that were staying sick, or they kind of got better, but then their how they were sick changed and they picked up new symptoms and it persisted and they just were not getting better. So I decided that I was interested in looking at that, and I knew from being in the academic environment and watching my colleagues and NIH and everything else, a ton of money had already gone into COVID research. There were the number of papers being published in the COVID area, as in the rapid publication of papers, was just astonishing, right? Because in a couple of short years, we were at the point where the number of COVID publications was dwarfing publications on diseases that had been around for 20, 30 years or more, right? So with that as kind of the background in my head and the expectations, right? I went into the literature. I said, well, we're starting to know a lot about COVID. Let's look at long COVID. Let's see what's known and understand about the mechanisms behind long COVID. And I really had intended to start a traditional drug discovery academic project with long COVID. And that's kind of when I went into literature, and I did what I normally do in terms of examining the literature and looking at the disease state, looking at the mechanisms behind it, what's known about it. And really what I was looking for were molecular targets for long COVID. And I went and I did my normal process, and I came to the end of it. And I came away with kind of two feelings that at the same time. One feeling was I was shocked because there was far less information in the literature than I thought there would be. And the other feeling I had was I was a little bit mad because it's that when you go through something and you look through it and you look through it and you're like, this is it. We don't have more than this yet. That was kind of the feeling that I came away from the long COVID literature with, and there wasn't really a good starting point for a real drug discovery project the way that an academic or pharmaceutical industry would actually try to start that process.
Let me ask you a question about that before we move on.
Yeah.
It was still early. To be fair, it was still
Hmm.
pretty early. Like long COVID even now is sort of
Yes.
it's a new disease. It's a new phenomenon. Why did you expect there to be more than there was?
So I think my expectation was I've done a lot of work in oncology, and the standards for speed in oncology have really changed over the past decade or 15 years, right? the expectation in the oncology area is you learn something and you move on it and you move fast and you move as fast as the most sophisticated science will let you go because it's a critical unmet need and people are dying. I expected that same urgency with long COVID, and it's not there. And it's still not there. We are doing things at what I call the normal pace of science with long COVID, where we are acting like there's an indefinite and extended amount of time to accumulate knowledge and trying to do anything. And I think the other reason I was surprised was one, the expectation from how oncology functions now, but then also everything surrounding COVID, especially like with the vaccines, and even with making things like remdesivir available and Paxlovid, was all about, societal level projects of putting in huge amounts of resources to do things quickly. So I think I had an assumption that there was going to be urgency in doing some of these scientific processes to move the ball forward to try to actually help people, where it's almost like with COVID, we developed the vaccines, took them to market, and developed remdesivir and Paxlovid and took it to market. And then everybody's like, well, okay, we're done. Like we don't need to put in huge resources and a lot of urgency anymore into that area,
Yeah.
which that was really what was surprising.
Yeah. And why do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
It's like I do and I don't, because I find it somewhat mystifying, because what I think of as the normal motivations, even the ones that aren't good, there seem to be met, and I don't understand why people aren't working on it. So the first thing you always think of is the patient population big enough for big pharma to make money on it, right? Because typically, if the answer is no, you're in an orphan disease status, and it is harder to get traction. But the numbers for people with long COVID are absolutely shocking. I read there was a good article I found, and this number's a year old now, but as of the end of 2023, there were supposedly 400 million cumulative cases of long COVID worldwide. That's a huge number. So
Yeah.
you can't say there's not a large enough patient population. It's hard to believe that you can't make money off of it if you're big pharma. So then you have to start putting in the work to be able to lay the foundation to do the drug discovery. That's what seems to be going very slow, and people aren't putting a ton of work into, with some notable exceptions, which we'll talk about. There's a few groups of scientists that have done some really good work in certain areas. But beyond that, there just has not been a huge ton of motivation and urgency put into it. And I don't know if it's because people still feel like it's controversial. People don't really want to. It might be that whole don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, because I feel like there's a lot of that sense with the spike protein. People are almost afraid of what they're going to find out when they start asking some of these questions.
And that's because the spike protein is the protein that the COVID shots teach the body essentially how to make for themselves.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the all of the issues around that, most of them non-scientific, right? Because to scientists, to physicians, protein's a protein, right? And you deal with it, and it is what it is, and it does what it does. And I think we found out a little bit too late, because we were trying to move too fast, that the spike protein is in and of itself somewhat toxic, is a bad actor in a lot of ways. The spike protein, it does seem to be what causes the issues behind long COVID. And yeah, people are reluctant to ask questions about it.
Yeah. Are people, I mean, I know I make this connection all the time clinically,
Mhm.
with someone who was well until they got a COVID shot and now they have basically long COVID symptoms. Is that
Yeah.
connection being acknowledged sort of in the larger world outside of my office or no?
I think it depends on who you talk to. Is it, I think most people on the street, the everyday people, I think are much more open to that concept at this point.
Mhm.
If I'm submitting papers to an editor of a journal, I don't know how warm a reception those concepts get still at this point. I think it's starting to get better. I know there was recently a paper published by one of the big research labs in the area on spike protein effects in vaccinated people. And the poor PI, principal investigator, he got roasted on Twitter, on X,
So his
because
paper
people
was
did
published.
not like.
So he had a peer-reviewed published paper and
Uh,
that's
it,
what
I
got roasted
they
or he was, yeah, go ahead.
they had done the work and they put up a preprint, and he was getting roasted for the preprint. Which, that's the last step before you're going to really put it in for peer review publication. But I will tell you, one of the things that really bothers me about COVID and long COVID science, for 2.5 years now, I have been consistently every once in a while doing searches for molecular level data and mechanisms of action behind vaccine injury. There's not a lot in the scientific literature. The papers just aren't there. But
Yeah.
when you do the same searches in long COVID, you find papers, you find data, you find things like the microclot hypothesis, which is kind of what I ended up following and using to do the work that I've done in the area. But the absence of publications and the absence of investigators asking questions is almost to the point where it's suspicious, where it's like, come on, nobody wants to ask and answer these questions when people both in the field and outside the field are smart enough to be able to ask these questions. No one's interested in answering them, or can. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Well, and this is part of the downsides of sort of quote evidence-based medicine is a lot of
Yeah,
times when people are throwing those words around, what they mean is there's no peer-reviewed, published, randomized controlled trial in the literature that demonstrates that this hypothesis is correct or incorrect, right? The absence
yeah,
of evidence in the literature isn't the absence of evidence, but people pretend that it is. And it does a disservice, I think, to conversation and to inquiry because it shuts down lines of thought for people just because when a patient hears there's no evidence for that, what they
yeah.
often hear is, we've actually studied this inside and out, and
Mhm.
we can't prove that that's true, and it appears false based on our data. But there's not data being collected, so there's actually no evidence because there's no
Yeah,
questioning, there's
yeah.
no looking into it.
No, and I'm right there with you on that one. And I understand the drive for evidence-based medicine. I understand it has its place. It's what everybody wants, right? It's the gold standard. Who doesn't want that, right? But what I have noticed in my time, especially in academia, is with the push for evidence-based medicine, there has been a decoupling from the way that science and medicine used to approach disease before we could do as sophisticated things as we do now. If you think back 50 or even 75 years ago, if you think back to the mid 20th century, most of the oncology drugs that we have, some of which we still use today, are came from nature, right? They're natural products, right? The old process used to be when we would figure out that people were sick, and we would try to figure out what the illness was and what the disease does, and we would study it, and we try to find something to help people while we study it. And oftentimes natural products, and particularly nutraceuticals, are often used in the early phases of understanding a disease state to try to help people with symptoms, to try to give them some relief, and to try to address root causes if you can. but with things that are safe and won't do any harm and will maybe not be a cure, but can help, right? And we operate in that mode for a while science and medicine do their processes to establish and collect enough data and information to do true drug discovery to come up with a real pharmaceutical product. That's the way we used to do things, right? Now it's like we don't want to acknowledge, or for the past little while, we have not wanted to acknowledge that those natural and non-pharmaceutical products can be used to help people, and nobody wants to use them unless there is a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial, which you typically don't do on those types of products. So we've arrived at this place where we've almost narrowed people's options, kind of like you said, and we're telling people, well, because we can't give you this, we can't do anything for you, which is not the way we've always done things historically.
Right. And which also really limits your options when you're, in 2020 and 2021, and there's no
Yeah.
vaccine and there's no Paxlovid, and you're trying to grapple with this new infection that is, after all, a virus, which
Yep.
on first principle, there are a lot of things you can do for viruses. You can wash out your
Yes.
nasal passages frequently, which is where the virus takes hold. You can
Mhm.
reduce your, you can increase your fruits and vegetables and your different vitamins. And so there are things that I think we eschewed because, again, like you said, there's no long-term data on COVID plus this thing. Well, of course not. COVID's brand new. How could there be? And yet
Yeah.
there's long-term evidence from experience, from extrapolation from other viruses and infections and immune system
Yeah.
problems that can support all of these natural things. Not to mention repurposed drugs, like ivermectin and
Mhm. Yep.
hydroxychloroquine,
Yep.
which were safe and turns out effective and being repurposed. And
Yeah.
also that whole conversation was shut down for many
Yeah.
of us. So yeah, to me it felt like, I'm just going to say this because I feel like it's a safe space, Keith. I
Yes.
just I felt like I felt like the world was going crazy, and I felt like my peers, my tribe of smart, really well
Mhm.
educated, compassionate doctor types, it's almost like their brain was hijacked by fear of stepping outside the lines or fear of dying from COVID or fear of doing something wrong by their patients. I couldn't understand why people weren't using their brains to say, look, how can we support people? Let's support our patients the way we've always done it, right? With
Yeah.
anything that'll work, that's not going to hurt, that could actually be a solution while we're trying to figure out whether there are solutions.
And I will tell you from the outside in, right? Because I'm not a clinician, I'm a scientist, I have a PhD. Um, I felt the same way, right? Because I will tell you, I remember one of the days in my career I was had those experiences in your career where you remember those days you learned something and it really changes your perspective. I remember being a postdoc and I figured out, I was working on something and we're like, yeah, it takes like 10 to 15 years to develop a pharmaceutical and do all the experiments and collect all the data and get through all the regulatory burden and show that it's selective and non-toxic and does exactly what it's supposed to do in the human body. And we have to get through this huge high level of proof to get a drug approved. And the day that I figured out that once I invent a drug and it gets approved, a doctor can take it and then go prescribe it for whatever they want, no matter what. I was incredulous. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I have to go through a decade of work to prove that the drug is for this specific thing, hits this specific target, and doesn't do anything else. And then the doctor can just go use it for whatever they want. And that's the way the world worked. And I had to learn to accept that. And it's still incredulous sometimes for me. But then we hit COVID and all of a sudden doctors were no longer allowed to prescribe things for anything they wanted. And I'm like, what's going on? What changed
Yeah.
that all of a sudden this privilege that doctors have, right? The way I think about it is one of the reasons doctors are compensated as well as they are is because their schooling takes so long, because at the end of the day, they have lives in their hands. And if they make bad decisions, people can potentially die. That's the both the reward and the burden of being a physician, right? So we give them extraordinary discretion in doing things. But then COVID hit, and all of a sudden, all of their discretion was withdrawn, and they weren't able to make decisions the way that they always had. That's another thing that again, kind of made me willing to rebel against the system in the way that I did, in taking the information about long COVID and formulating a product to actually help people now that they could take without having to ask anybody's permission. And that's really why I did what I did.
I love that rebellion. Let's talk about that. So you've
Sure.
given us some insight into sort of how you chose your project and what your process was like. You've sort of hinted at this hypothesis of microclots. Talk to us
Mhm.
about what you landed on and what you did with it.
Sure. So, like I said, I went into the literature. I did what I normally do to try and find a project, and I really didn't find what I needed. And I stopped for a minute, and I kind of thought to myself, I was like, well, I can just go do something else, right? I can go find another problem to work on. But by then, I had gotten to know some people with long COVID, and it was very clear they weren't getting help. There's not a lot of help coming from primary care physicians. They were getting shuttled around to specialists, from cardiologists to neurologists to rheumatologists. Like they were on like this kind of carousel of physicians. Nobody was really helping them. There weren't any pharmaceuticals to help them. There weren't a whole lot of nutraceutical products. So I kind of said to myself, well, I know there's a need here. I know there's people that need help. And it was one of those kind of gut check moments of, I knew just looking at the landscape that we're at least 10 to 15 years away from any kind of pharmaceutical drug for long COVID. And that if nobody was going to step in and start doing anything now, these people were just going to have to suffer for that whole time. So I decided to go back to the literature, and I asked a different question. I approached the literature with a different mindset. Instead of saying, well, what are the molecular targets to start doing drug discovery? I went back to literature and said, okay, what do we actually know about the biological mechanisms behind long COVID? What do we know enough about to actually take action on now, regardless of what that action is? So when I went back to the literature, I found what's called the microclots hypothesis. And the microclots hypothesis it basically states that the spike protein from COVID binds to clotting proteins in the bloodstream, and in binding causes this conformational change in a protein called fibrinogen. And in causing this conformational change, it causes these clotting proteins to polymerize in an unnatural way and form microclots. And that basically, if you look at all the symptoms of long COVID, a lot of them can be explained as being downstream effects that are caused by microclots that result in the circulatory system. They cause inflammation in the circulatory system. They cause immune system effects. They cause the brain fog and the fatigue, and a lot of the cardiac effects can be explained by the formation of microclots that's driven by spike protein.
Makes perfect sense to me, and it's one of the pathways I've been working on too, but through different ways. So how did you figure out what to do about the microclots since you decided that was
Okay.
your project?
So one of the things I really liked about the scientists, the biological scientists that were working on the microclot hypothesis and really putting it forward, was they did really good molecular level experiments. I'm a molecular level guy, right? I like my proof, right? So they took spike protein that they made in the lab synthetically and added it to fibrinogen and could show that it would form clots. They added it to blood samples, could show that it would form microclots. Like, they did a lot of very good molecular level work to show that this is really what's going on in long COVID. Okay, so I spent a lot of time going through that data. I made a bunch of content to try to explain to people with long COVID what this is and how it works and what microclots look like. A lot of that information, because I didn't feel like it was accessible to people with long COVID. And you know, you're in the weeds in the literature at that point. And I was trying to help disseminate that information and help people learn about it. So in the microclot literature, a couple of the scientists that were working on this, they actually carried it forward to the logical extension. So they said, okay, we know that spike protein causes microclots. They actually came up with their own laboratory assay to actually visualize microclots, right? Because the other problem with long COVID is there's no laboratory tests for it, clinical laboratory tests for it. There's no, I'm going to run this blood test and tell you you have long COVID. We don't have one yet, right? And with microclots, we also don't really have a clinical lab test. So they developed a research laboratory test to be able to visualize microclots with a microscope, right? So, and they started testing patients, and basically every patient they examined that clinically had long COVID had microclots. Like they collected a lot of the good foundational data to say, okay, this is really what's happening in long COVID. And then
Like
they carried it
proof
to
of concept, right? Like that's their proof of concept
absolutely
to base their further research on.
right. And they actually carried it forward all the way to the logical conclusion of they said, well, if people have microclots, can we take a combination of anticoagulants and try and break up the microclots? And they used a therapy called triple anticoagulant therapy. It's actually a mixture of 3 anticoagulants. So it's pretty powerful stuff, right? It's not something for the faint of heart. There's some issues with it, right? So, but they did a small study on about 90 long COVID patients. They put them all on triple anticoagulant therapy. They actually did the work to show that they all had microclots before they started the triple anticoagulant therapy. And then after a time period, and they stratified it based on a severe long COVID group and a more mild group. After anywhere from 4 to 6 months on triple anticoagulant therapy, about 80% of long COVID patients recovered from long COVID. And the patients that recovered from long COVID, their microclots were gone.
Wow.
So, okay, so when I found that, I went back to the long COVID people. I was like, guys, this problem's solved. Why aren't you all taking triple anticoagulant therapy? This is a no-brainer to me. Like 80% recovery rate. Why are you guys all still in bed and suffering? Turns out triple anticoagulant therapy really has kind of 3 drawbacks to it. One is it's 3 anticoagulants taken together, and there's a safety issue, right? There's a significant risk of a side effect of serious bleeding when you use 3 anticoagulants together. So that's one issue. The second issue is 2 of the 3 drugs in that combination were prescription drugs. So you had to go to a physician to get it. And the physicians were, I will say, I try to be fair, and I say the physicians were understandably reluctant to prescribe triple anticoagulant therapy between the risk of bleeding and the fact that it was a small study. There's no large evidence-based study supporting it. I can see a lot of physicians not necessarily wanting to be responsible for prescribing that to people. And then the third issue is one of the drugs in particular is really expensive. And insurance won't always cover it for long COVID because it's not actually approved for that indication. So there's an access issue from the physicians, plus there's a financial issue, plus there is a safety issue. So I looked at all of that and said, well, is there something I can do about that? And that's kind of the next place I went with things.
So before we go to where you went, can you say what those 3 drugs were? Because I'm sure people are interested.
Sure. So the 3 drugs in triple anticoagulant therapy are Eliquis, apixaban, which is a factor 10A inhibitor. It's aspirin, right? Low-dose aspirin, which is a COX-1 and COX-2 inhibitor. It's a platelet activation inhibitor. And clopidogrel, which is also a platelet activation inhibitor. It's a P2Y1, P2Y12 receptor antagonist.
So that's doctor speak, fancy scientists speak for they're inhibiting the various factors and proteins that kind of assemble or disassemble and in some way lead up to your body's ability to form a clot, breaking down your body's ability to form a clot. So I want to stop you there for 1 second. So what I heard you say at the beginning was the mechanism by which this microclot hypothesis says long COVID or spike proteins cause clotting is through a binding of the spike protein to fibrinogen, changing its conformation such that it becomes more sticky, more clotty, more apt to create these microclots, right? So I didn't hear anything about factor 10 or any of these other players in that particular mechanism. So can you kind of break down for me your story for why it still works to do the work that it seems to be doing for long COVID patients?
Sure. So I think what's going on is, so spike protein causes this change in fibrinogen and then makes it sticky and it initiates an unnatural clotting process, right? So factor 10A is actually one of the enzymes in the natural clotting process we call coagulation cascade. Right. So I think what happens is once the spike protein initiates the fibrinogen conformational change and initiates the microclots, what seems to happen, and this is the really bad part, is once a microclot forms, it's almost self-initiating. So it keeps growing and it can induce this conformational change in other fibrinogen molecules and cause like daughter microclots without additional spike protein. So that seems to be there's actually literature data, there's experimental data that kind of shows that it's almost like a self-propagating chain reaction type polymerization. So I think what happens is the spike protein catalyzes the initial microclot, and if you have spike protein floating around, it's continuously catalyzing more microclot formation. But what happens is once the microclots start, then additional clotting, any kind of additional clotting that goes on, if there is any activation of the coagulation cascade, then you are getting additional buildup of the microclot through an additional pathway of the coagulation cascade. And then the other two anticoagulants that are in triple anticoagulant therapy actually don't interfere directly with clot formation. They have to do with inhibiting what we call platelet activation. So part of the clotting process is actually, the clot forms out of protein to stop the bleeding. But at the same time, the clots actually stick to platelets, and platelets get activated, and that kicks off a whole bunch of other mechanistic events that take place. So typically when you have clotting, there is a coagulation cascade, natural clotting piece, and there's a platelet activation piece. And you have to have both of them for natural clotting. And when microclots form, spike protein starts this unnatural clotting process that in the process also activates platelets. And all those downstream effects that happen with platelet activation that contribute to an increase in the size, the stickiness of the microclots. So what seems to happen is you take these three quote unquote anticoagulants. It's really one anticoagulant and two platelet activation inhibitors. And if you use all three of those together, you're able to bring down and lower the activation of all those mechanisms that basically slows down clot formation to the point where the body's more easily able to digest and clear the microclots on its own. Because the other issue with microclots is because they're an unnatural conformation, the normal natural clot busting, clot dissolving mechanisms are much slower and don't work as well on the microclot because they're in an unnatural conformation. So it's like the body needs the support to be able to slow down platelet activation, slow down clot formation, to help the body more easily clear these unnatural clots. And that, I think, is really how triple anticoagulant therapy is helping people recover.
So thank you for that really clear explanation. I wonder if you also have thoughts on what's going on with those 20% of people who didn't get better.
So that, unfortunately, that could be a number of different things. So I think one of the things that's going to dictate whether you're able to recover on triple anticoagulant therapy is what your spike protein loading is like. right? If you've got a very low level and then you start on triple anticoagulant therapy, you start to be able to clear microclots, and maybe in bringing down some of that clotting and platelet activation, it actually also helps the immune system recover a little bit, and you're able to clear the spike protein. That would allow you to fully recover. So I could, to be able to not recover on that type of treatment would be some kind of viral persistence where you have a super high spike load that even if you slow down the coagulation and microclot formation, you're still getting new microclot formation because you have a higher spike protein loading. It's likely, and it's likely effects like that where um, bringing down the microclot load alone isn't sufficient to correct mechanistically what's going on in the pathophysiology. Maybe there's immune system effects that are predominating and aren't, and even though you're clearing the microclots, you're still getting some of the long COVID symptoms and pathology still occurring.
Yeah. I'm also wondering about what happened to these folks after they recovered. Did they need to remain on triple anticoagulant therapy for, beyond that to maintain their gains? Because presumably some of them still do have spike proteins floating around. Or if they had the jab and their body was able to reverse transcribe that mRNA into their DNA, they could make spike for
Yeah.
life. You could get that faucet, in other words, is still turned on for
Yeah.
some.
I have not seen any longitudinal follow-up on that one study that was done, but in that study, it was kind of they were on it for a fixed period of time, and then basically the people that recovered came off of it and were able to not have to continue on it. So now that study was done in 2023. It did not differentiate vaccination status, which is one of the issues with it. So it's unclear what the people's spike protein potential, long-term exposure to spike protein would be. But if you can lower spike protein loads to the point where they're not inducing a lot of new microclot formation, theoretically you would be able to take triple anticoagulant therapy, recover, and then come off of it. If you there's would also be the possibility of, if you do have continuing spike loading, you could be on maybe a chronic version of, you could be chronically on a version of triple anticoagulant therapy long term that would help make you functional, help with the microclot issue. But if you have a persistence of spike protein, if you stop taking it, then presumably your symptoms might get worse.
Yeah. I'm super interested in the 20% because of course those are the people that usually show up at my door, the people who don't get well
Right.
with the usual treatments. And one of the things that is that I'm finding in a lot of those people are genetics around
Mm,
Pi1, like the Pi1 4G, 5G genetics, which basically means they don't break down clots normally. So it sounds like this triple anticoagulant is
yeah,
not getting at both sides of the pathway, right? It reduces the body's making of these microclots so that if you're normal in terms of your genetics
yes.
of breaking down clots, your body should handle that. My guess is those 20% are probably the ones who have some issues breaking down clots at baseline, and so they're not able
Yep.
to kind of balance out the field.
No, and that's entirely possible. Yeah, and that would be a really good hypothesis to look into for that 20%.
Cool. So let's talk about what you did next, because
Yeah.
we're almost at the sort of the punchline, which is you've got a really cool product that doesn't
Mhm.
require a ton of money or a doctor and have terrible
Yeah.
effects, potential side effects. So let's get there.
Right. So looking at triple anticoagulant therapy and microclots, it's like, well, okay, here's a solution for this, but there's drawbacks to it, right? There's a safety issue. There's an accessibility issue. You have to get a script from a physician for triple anticoagulant therapy, and it's expensive, right? Especially if insurance will not cover some things. So I kind of sat down and I said, well, what people with long COVID really need is a safer, accessible, and affordable version of this. And I sat down and I mentioned a couple times I've had some experience with natural products, right? And for my PhD, I did natural product total synthesis, and then when I became a medicinal chemist, I used to use natural products as the starting points to develop new drugs. And I always loved natural products. One of the themes in my career is interesting mechanisms of action. And that's something that I kind of carried forward from my time with natural products, is because we looked at them because they had always novel and unique mechanisms of action. So I started thinking about the problem and I said, well, we know 3 drugs that we can put together and solve this problem for long COVID. And we know the mechanisms of action of these drugs. I said, well, what if instead of doing what I've normally done for my career and starting with a natural product and then taking that mechanism of action and making small molecule drugs, what if I basically inverted the process and just reversed the process and reverse engineered the pharmaceutical drugs through their mechanisms of action into natural ingredients and see if combining the natural ingredients would have the same effect as the pharmaceutical triple anticoagulant therapy. So that's what I did. I put in the work and spent the time looking at the mechanisms of action of the pharmaceutical drugs and triple anticoagulant therapy, reverse engineered them through those mechanisms of action and found natural components that had the same mechanisms of action. Now, they're less potent, which is why they're safer, right? Why you can take them in over-the-counter products and you don't need a prescription for them. They also have the advantage of being affordable. And they also have the advantage of they're over the counter, right? They're nutraceutical supplement type ingredients. So I took that combination of natural products that I came up with, which was turmeric and white willow extract and a extract from traditional Chinese medicine called Dan Shen. And I formulated them together into a product I called Circuguard. And started making that and sharing it with people with long COVID, and it really does seem to work and help people recover from long COVID.
So to put a point on it, just so people understand what this reverse engineering kind of looks like in actual supplements. So the turmeric, my understanding is that's the kind
Yep.
of Eliquis sort of substitute. It's the
Yes.
factor 10 inhibitor.
Yep.
The willow bark is actually, where aspirin came from, right? The white
Yeah.
willow extract. So it works by platelet activation inhibition. And then the danshen is the Plavix, right? The Plavix kind of
Yes.
correlate. So
Yep.
you have a couple things in that. Tell us about the beetroot and the black pepper.
Sure. So let's start with the black pepper extract. So if you go to Amazon or go anywhere and look at turmeric supplements now, you'll often see they have black pepper extract in them. And basically, the black pepper extract helps with the bioavailability of the turmeric once it's in the body. So turmeric has an issue where the active ingredient in it, the curcumin, has a really fast metabolism for most people in liver. The black pepper extract actually acts as a sacrificial substrate for the liver metabolism and protects the turmeric and helps the turmeric have more circulation in the body for longer without being chewed up by metabolism. So that's a fairly standard thing you'll see in turmeric, any kind of supplement that's got turmeric in it. So then the beetroot extract was a little something I added because one of the common symptoms for long COVID is fatigue, right? And when I don't know how you look at them, but when I look at people with long COVID, I see like a couple of core symptoms that like everybody has. And it's fatigue and it's brain fog and usually some kind of cardiac shortness of breath, tachycardia, heart rate issue. Those seem to be the core symptoms. And then beyond that, a bunch of people have other different symptoms going on along with those, but those are the real core symptoms of long COVID. Knowing that, I wanted to try and put something in the product that would help people with fatigue and help them right away. So I was thinking about it, and one of the hypotheses for how fatigue is caused in long COVID is that the red blood cells that carry oxygen into the tissues actually bind to the microclots because they're sticky and get tied up with the microclot. So, and it actually explains everything you see in long COVID patients with their oxygenation. So the blood still gets oxygenated, but these red blood cells are stuck to the microclot and can't diffuse into the tissue. So you're not getting good oxygen delivery. So I wanted to help people, and the decrease in oxygen delivery is what causes the fatigue. So I wanted to help people with fatigue kind of more directly and more immediately. So putting the beetroot in, the nitrates in the beetroot help deliver oxygen more efficiently into the tissues. So the red blood cells that are making it into the tissues and are carrying oxygen, you're getting more efficient oxygen delivery, and that helps with the fatigue.
And just to get really mechanistic, I believe that's because the nitric oxide is actually acting on smooth muscle in the vasculature,
Yeah.
in the arterioles, the small arteries, and allowing them to open up their
Yep.
diameter. So even if the microclot's still there and the little gooey, sticky red blood cell is still there, it's all going to get pushed a little further down the train so that it can actually deliver to the furthest part of the tissues, which often is things like your brain or your
Brain.
fingers or
Yes.
your toes that get cold and numb if you don't get blood flow in them.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I put that in there, because it was one of those where it's like, wow, that could actually have a it could have a real effect for people kind of right away as their body's starting to break down microclots and dealing with some of those. Having that beetroot extract and having those effects could not only help the fatigue but also help the brain fog, help some of the extremities issues, like temperature issues, some of the neuropathy, some of those types of things.
Cool. So what have you seen in people taking your product? Do you get feedback from customers who send
Um,
love
I,
letters?
I do. I get a lot of emails, some social media posts some DMs. People start taking, and there appear to be a couple of groups. A lot of people will start taking it, and they will see an effect, within the first, week or so. And they're not like totally better, but all of a sudden they can function better. Or I had one person take it, and he made a video and sent it to me. He's like, oh my God, I didn't realize I still had brain fog this bad, because he took it and all of a sudden the brain fog lifted, and he realized how bad the brain fog was, right? I have had some other people take it that have been on it for several months, where they're basically, they've gone from being kind of not completely bedridden, but being very low function, to actually being functional again in daily life and being able to be up and present with the kids and work and actually do things in life, and not have to plan their day around the limited energy that they have.
Amazing. I mean, as you're telling me these stories, and I imagine you kind of in between classes in the university and doing this bench research, and I'm seeing you get these little love DMs from people. What does it feel like to have this close of a connection to the end user of someone that you have developed to help people's health?
I mean, it's really good, and it's why I did it. It I'm that kind of person. It's like, if I don't think that's going to help somebody, I won't do it. I don't need to do it for me, right? I'm really doing it to try and really help people. And if I didn't think it really helped people, I wouldn't keep doing it. That's just kind of, that's the way kind of that I am. So, especially in one of the people's video kind of early on, um, as the product was just becoming available. One of the people in my audience made a video, and it had the tearjerker line in it that really just hits you, because she made a comment of she could actually be a mom to her kids again, because she could actually get out of bed and function during the day and be a caregiver to her kids. It's you know that's that's what it's all about. And I am an academic. I am a scientist. The lives I'm used to touching are more students I'm teaching, right? Not as directly people with products that I do, because usually the work that I'm doing as an academic, I'm publishing papers. It's part of the larger body of science that moves things forward. It is not a direct impact on people's lives. And this is actually something that is really impacting people's lives and helping make them better.
I love that so much. And I love how simple it is and how easily you were able to kind of, I mean, to me, it just seems so obvious. Like you focus on the mechanism and you use what will work. Is there anybody who shouldn't use your product?
Um, So obviously, if you have any allergies, especially some people do have an allergy to white willow, or if you have an allergy to the turmeric or the beetroot. I guess some people are allergic to beetroot. So those are the immediate ones. I usually tell people if you're already on an anticoagulant, you should probably not take Circuguard with an anticoagulant because it might be too much. A pharmaceutical anticoagulant. So if somebody is on Eliquis, I would usually tell them, you might want to come off the Eliquis and then start taking it and trying it and seeing what happens.
Yeah. And just so people know, and a lot of people who follow this podcast know that I had a stroke in 2022, and I've been on Eliquis since 2023 when I discovered that I had, through blood tests, still a lot of clot formation happening. And I was telling you earlier, Keith, that doesn't make me happy to
Yeah.
be
Mm-mm.
on a pharmaceutical agent. And so I have been looking and looking and looking high and low for exactly what you've created, I think.
Mhm.
So I will be starting it and I will share my results with both you and
So,
this audience because I want people to have options, right? I want people to have things that are accessible and affordable and
yeah,
safe and that work, right? Kind of
yeah,
checks all my boxes. So
absolutely.
thank you for your commitment to your fellow humans and for, bringing your really smart brain and your really excellent process and your integrity to this project. I think it's going to change a lot of lives.
Well, thank you. And what I really like about it is it's very simple, like you said, and everything in it is natural and is safe, right? If you go into whatever local store and start looking at turmeric and white willow and even danshin, you're going to find all those components in much higher doses than they are in Circuguard. The reason the product works specifically for the microclots and for long COVID is the combination of the various ingredients together. That's the important part. And that's what you get when you kind of take this more science-based approach to looking at these things. It's not just about it being a supplement product or trying to help to come up with any supplement that will help people with long COVID, because I feel like there's a lot of that going on. This was really scientifically designed, understanding long COVID biology and the mechanisms behind it. And it's the combination of ingredients in the product that are actually how it actually helps people.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to share links to your website where people can
Mhm.
purchase this if they want, the sciencedrivensupplements.com. We'll also invite people to check out your blog there. You've got some really
Yep.
good overviews of both the microclot
Mhm.
hypothesis and some other ideas around mechanisms. And I think people can learn a lot from following you. Before we end, is there anything we haven't touched on that you feel would be helpful for this community of wellness seekers who are always looking for
Sure.
tools, tips, mindset shifts to help them be healthier?
Um, so let me just mention, so one of the things I did do when I did this was I wanted all the research to be accessible without interference. So all of the research I did in looking at microclots and figuring out all of the ingredients in the product are all on my Substack. So people can go check that out. And the best way to find my Substack and all my social media is if they go to keithcellisphd.com. That has links to everything. In terms of mindset, I think what I see in the long COVID community is a healthy skepticism, a desire for real kind of scientific based approaches to trying to find things to help them. The one thing I would caution people with is being overly skeptical, because I feel like the long COVID population has been so abused by the medical establishment. They have been, to a certain extent, abused by the health and wellness space of everybody trying to shill whatever product they can think of for long COVID, whether there's a rationale for it or not. And that's actually what bothers me a lot about products in the space is what's the real scientific rationale behind using it? Even if there's not an evidence-based study, can you at least tell me why? So I would encourage people with long COVID to want to know the why behind what they're taking And if they believe in the why, to go ahead and try it. And if they don't, then they have to, I would think twice about doing it.
Great, great last words. And one last question I have for you, since I'm still thinking about those 20% keeps me up at night. Those are the 20% of people who, again, come to my practice, and I'm always sort of trying to find mechanisms for why it's not working for them. Any hope in the future of you looking for a second project for those 20%?
Yes and no. So I have a couple other things I've been thinking about. One of the big issues with long COVID is viral persistence. And one of the biggest hypotheses behind where the reservoir for viral persistence is in the GI tract. So I've been thinking about and working on that. That obviously gets into the microbiome and some of those other issues. I have been trying to think about kind of spike detox and better ways to go about that. I don't have a real good actionable solution at this point. But I think when I look at this, I think about viral reservoirs. I think about what can we do about spike protein. I think about what can we do about microclots. And then we have to start looking downstream of microclots. I've also been spending a little bit of time on the immunity aspect, which I think is one of the biggest long-term issues. But that's a much more complicated system to really try and think about doing something for. And again, that's one of those where I don't have a good idea yet, but I'm trying to figure it out.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you haven't stopped thinking about this really important problem that so many people are struggling with. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing, have done to support this population. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts here.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me to talk to you today.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Healing Grove podcast. If you liked it, please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to deepen your experience further, consider grabbing a copy of the Healing Grove Playbook. With journal prompts for this podcast and 41 others, it's the perfect place to record your learnings, keep track of the tools you explore, and reflect on your own experience. Finally, it's important to mention that even though I am a doctor, nothing you hear on this podcast, whether from myself or my guests, constitutes medical advice. Any intervention you try should always be discussed with and supervised by a trusted member of your own healing team. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Healing Grove.